Ladies and gentlemen, can I get you seated, please? Welcome everybody to the General Purpose Meeting, Tuesday 11th of September. I welcome the public and the media to the General Purpose Meeting and remind that this meeting is being recorded and live streamed. I would like to ask for everyone to please turn off their mobile phones to silent for the duration of the meeting. Please be aware that a hearing loop is available. Staff members are able to assist you with this at any time during the meeting. Please remain quiet in the gallery so that everyone can hear the meeting. Anyone disrupting the meeting may be asked to leave. I would like to remind everybody the General Purpose Meeting do not have any public question times. If you would like to submit a public question, please refer to the information available on the Council website or contact customer service. The City of Casey acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land, the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people, and pays respect to all elders past and present. Tonight I ask if there's any apologies. No apologies.
Mr. Chair, Councillor Gilledge is an apology.
Councillor Gilledge, thank you. Is there a move and second to accept the apologies of Councillor Gilledge? Thank you. Councillor Ablett and Councillor Saray, thank you. That is carried. Declaration of interest. Declaration by councillors of any conflict of interest, personal interest pursuant to the Section 79(79)(b) of the Local Government Act 1989 in any items of notice paper. Does any councillor have any conflict of interest or personal interest that they may wish to declare? Interest must also be declared immediately before consideration of the item. Before we move to officers' reports, I would like to remind everyone the General Purpose Committee is an advisory committee and no monetary funds can be committed at these meetings. There is one presentation tonight. Can I ask Mr. Schultz and Mr. Harding from Fred's Tiny Houses to come down to the lectern? Mr. Schultz, you have 10 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Amanda Stapleton, who kind of helped us get our ability to be here, I think, is directly a result of you being taking an interest in tiny houses on wheels, so thank you. There's the thank you. The aim of this presentation that I'd like to do tonight for you is to provide you the current state of play for the understanding of where tiny houses on wheels fit within a council regulatory framework. Trying to take your sort of perspective on this. Secondly, if your council goal is to sanction a tiny house on wheels housing option for people, I'll suggest a sensible and efficient way to do so. In this presentation, I'll try and do the following. From a regulatory standpoint, what is a tiny house on wheels? What is the difference between a tiny house on wheels and a caravan? And then this is sort of this idea of, well, people may not want it, and how do we move people from understanding what a tiny house is and what it's not, and then maybe saying, yes, I'd like that in my backyard. What would it take to become the first city council in Australia to sanction and regulate tiny houses on wheels? I'll make a suggestion to you. And a word about tiny houses on wheels as a solution for homelessness. It's something that's talked a lot about, and some misunderstandings there, I think. So, if you can see the screen, or, you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words. This is what a tiny house on wheels is. This is some other examples of them. A small answer is a small dwelling on a road-registered trailer. So it may look like a house, but it's not a building. It's a road vehicle. Don't be fooled. It's not a building. They look nice, but you have to think road vehicle. This is myself and my family. This is the tiny house that I built. We started building, I started designing in 2010, and then finished it in 2015. So from a regulatory standpoint, Camden Council, just bringing this to your awareness, Camden Council in New South Wales contended that this tiny house was a building and not a caravan. And they went to the Land and Environment Court and they lost. And you can read the decision. It's provided online there and given the case number. And then also you should have it in your packet there. So you can read the fine detail. The second sort of case that I want to bring to your attention is Brisbane City Council in Queensland contended that this tiny house on wheels constituted building works. And once again, it was taken to a tribunal. This was the Building and Development Dispute Resolution Committee there in Queensland. And once again, the Brisbane City Council lost, and you can see the reasons given in the citation there. Basically, it boils down to this, that it is not building works, it is a road vehicle. And councils, when they attempt to legislate and view them as buildings, they are knocked back because it doesn't meet the definition of a building or a structure. And this is being tested now in the courts. So the difference between a tiny house on wheels and a caravan, these are not tiny houses on wheels. These are old, broken down caravans which, adversely affect amenity, safety, character of a community. No one wants them. They make neighbors grumpy, and then they call your offices. That's not what we want. But it is a question, what is the difference then between a tiny house on wheels and a new caravan? Well, the answer, I don't say really, I say it laughingly, but it's a little bit funny, but it's the smell after 10 years. And the reason for that is that caravans are designed to travel frequently, and they're economical on the road. They're a bit more aerodynamic. They're made of, but the building materials are made of lightweight materials such as plastics, aluminum. They rely on silicon caulking to keep the water out. And over time, what happens is that silicon fails, water enters the interior of the wall, which you can see pictured here, and the water gets in, it grows mold, and it smells like every old caravan that you've ever been in that was past its use-by date. So this is the main difference between a tiny house and a caravan, is that they're built with traditional building materials to shed water. And the answer number two there is that longevity is another difference, that a well-designed tiny house on wheels should shed water like a big house and have a long life. So in summary here, local laws and planning regulations, the consensus seems to be emerging about how to classify tiny houses. So, and this is particular to, while I hear a lot, we do workshops in a lot of other states. I'm giving you my hometown in Victoria and in Castlemaine. It's what I know best. Caravans are viewed, they're regulated by Vic Roads as road vehicles. But in terms of council, they're viewed as camping oftentimes, and they're limited by the amount of time that you can be living in them. And this is generally in local laws. Otherwise, if it's on a foundation and it's a small house with another house nearby on the same lot, then it's a dependent person's dwelling in Victoria. So if we go into the Casey local laws, these are your laws. You'll get to property and amenity, and number 19 is temporary dwellings on private property. And here is where the limitation is in the city of Casey. You can only be there for more than 14 days in any 60-day period. So it's a very temporary and short-term thing for caravans. So if you would want to become the first council in Australia to legally sanction a tiny house on wheels as a housing option and to regulate them as such, it's a fairly straightforward thing, because you already have a procedure laid out where you have a permitting process for each of these things, and you would just need to create a new permitting process for a tiny house on wheels. You could basically say anything you wanted in it, of course. It's your right and it's your authority to legislate in that local laws area. and make the distinction for this new thing that had not existed not long ago, a tiny house on wheels. Finally, living in a tiny house on wheels and avoiding regulation does have some hidden costs. Currently, most tiny houses build a tiny house on wheels and they park it on private land, and they make friends with the neighbors. And people are doing this out there. They may not be telling you about it, but they are doing it, and they're avoiding the application of those rules that we saw just earlier because they're making nice with the neighbors, and the neighbors are happy enough, and no one's complaining. So, as I say in the slide there, there is a cost, and it is, and I know this from our own experiences, having lived in a tiny house, that there is a bit of an emotional, psychic cost. Knowing that you're living just outside the sanctioned rules of the community by living in a tiny house. And then finally, I did want to say about this idea of homelessness. Oftentimes it's said that tiny houses on wheels are a solution to homelessness, and I just want to point out to you that the technical definition of homelessness includes housing stress, which means that you're not quite sure from night to night that you're going to be able to live in that place, that you don't have the official sanction of the ruling community, of council, to continue to live there. And so without that avenue for a legally sanctioned living, tiny houses on wheels will not address homelessness, because that, it's an ambiguous area. You're not really allowed to live in it. And tiny house dwellers now, tiny house on wheels dwellers now, are technically homeless by this definition. So, I guess my point there in the very last line is that when you look at housing, it isn't really about the house. It's about what that house does to connect you to your community. And having a tiny house on wheels provides a way for people to be connected to the community in organic ways, in the backyard and things like that. Finally, I'm a big fan of Henry David Thoreau. This is a quote from him. He says, "Most men or women," he wrote in a time long ago, "appear never to have considered what a house is, and are actually, though, needlessly poor all their lives because they think that they must have such a one as their neighbors have." So basically, Thoreau is saying, let's think outside the box. And I'm so delighted to be able to make this presentation to you. I think I did it under 10, did I?
You did indeed, with a couple of seconds to spare. Thank you, Mr.
Okay.
Schultz, for your presentation. Before I go to Councillor Stapleton, I just want to ask you a question. If you had a tiny house in someone's backyard and you piped your plumbing into the tiny house, would that then consist that it becomes a dwelling?
That's probably a question for your staff. I wouldn't be in a position to really authoritatively answer that. There are these different definitions, and sometimes it is plumbing that, they're legal definitions of what a dwelling is, and I'm probably not the one to...
Okay, thank you. Councillor Stapleton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we've got to call this lovely gentleman Fred, because that promotes his business, Fred's Tiny Houses. So thank you very much. And Fred, thank you so much. And Ben, for being here. We had a wonderful day down in Fitzroy not so long ago. Yeah. It was a gathering of a lot of people who are building their own tiny houses, which is fantastic. And you're giving them really good expert guidance in doing that. Two questions. One is, do you feel that kind of gathering is only going to grow like it is in America? It is huge in America, yeah. And certainly I feel it will grow here. And number two is, could you enlighten us just a little bit with some work that's been done in Fremantle that's been very successful?
Sure. So in answer to your first question, Amanda, I think that when we ask people who attend, there are, if I can remember, there are about 5 different values for the reasons why they come. And it's a pretty broad and evenly divided. Freedom, they want the freedom to regain their time. Instead of working for the man, they reduce their costs by living in a tiny house and they get the time back. Others are the truly devoted in terms of trying to walk softly on the earth and reduce their footprint. Others have to do with the affordability, just trying to make ends meet. I can't remember all of them, but there are a lot of quite worthy, and yeah, it's growing. I would say too, Amanda, just to tell you how our workshops have grown, and the demographic that has changed the most, the group that has grown the greatest, isn't the 20-somethings or the 30-somethings, they're the women looking at retirement. The women who are older and they don't have as much superannuation, they're looking around for options, and options that connect them in with their people. And a tiny house on wheels can be moved to wherever their people are, and that's a big advantage for them. They often talk about clustering them together. Fremantle. So in Fremantle, there was a councillor there, can't remember her name, had bright red hair. She got on board with the tiny house project, and she got the staff to come up to, now we're talking about tiny houses on foundations in Fremantle. What I've discussed with you here is primarily tiny houses on wheels. In Fremantle, they looked at how to build small tiny houses, small homes that met the Building Code of Australia. And basically it was, you could go down to the council and get approved plans for small dwellings, and they clustered them together so there would be, on a lot, there would be 5 or 6 tiny houses on foundations together. And there was quite a lot of, they paid a lot of attention to free space, green space, and yeah, and it met all of the building codes, which tiny houses on wheels are going to struggle to meet the Building Code of Australia. Why? Because one's an apple and the other's an orange. One's a road vehicle, the other's, a building. And you can't make one, meet the other. In some ways you'll get some overlap, but basically they're different. And that's part of my main, I'm thrilled to be here. I mean, how many times do we have a council ask and say, hey, what could we change to make this a reality? And, here's to you guys, to be open to hearing. So, thanks.
Thank you. I'll go to Councillor Ablett, then back to Councillor Stapleton, if that's all right.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Fred. Just a quick one. What's the price range for the tiny houses on wheels?
Yeah.
If someone wanted to buy one.
If you want to buy one, you're looking at probably $50,000 to $120,000. 120 would probably be the one that's off the grid and batteries and solar panels. The lower end one would be much smaller, probably for a single person, but for full-time living. Now, that is what it would take if I build it for somebody, or somebody who builds tiny houses that does it. Oftentimes, what people do is they'll buy a trailer for about $10,000. And then they'll do the work themselves on the weekends, and they will build it for a whole lot less than that.
Councillor, thank you, Councillor Ablett. Councillor Stapleton, and then Councillor Tristani.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just 2 more things, and just on the back of my comment or question about how do you think the following is going to end up here in Australia? The Municipal Association of Victoria have actually got I told you, a tiny house subcommittee, which I'm attending tomorrow. So that's going to be the second one for the year. Sorry?
I think I'm going to be there with you on Thursday.
Thursday?
Thursday, anyway.
I've got it in my calendar for tomorrow, so we better talk.
Okay.
But certainly, how exciting, and I'm glad you followed that up. So my question is, do you think we can have the same following here in Australia? And the other thing is to foreshadow that I'd like to add an extension to the recommendation, Mr. Chairman, and I'll outline that when we've all finished.
Okay. Sorry, was there a question in there?
Yes,
no.
Sorry, do you think we're going to have the same following in Australia that we have?
Yeah, well, I don't think that we have quite the burst of the housing bubble that they have had after the GFC in the States, but housing affordability is driving this a lot. And, people are living at home in their parents' house, and they may be resigned to living in the family lot, but they might want to have a little bit more space. And I think that, Melbourne trying to increase housing density, this is a natural way to increase housing density without breaking the bank. Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Tristani.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, I just want to thank you for your presentation. It's opened my eyes a little bit more to this theme. The Planning Act of Victoria, just perhaps through you, Mr. Chair, how do we make advocacy in order to make changes to the Planning Act, and what we're guided by in order to bring about possibility of having Mr. Coldham, maybe?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. Look, what I'd suggest is we don't have our planning enforcement local laws experts here tonight, but we might have a meeting post tonight and meet with those experts and get some further advice.
Thank you. I'd like to actually have some feedback from that meeting, if that's all right, because I'm curious as to what needs to change. And if you have to downsize into a big house, that's a real challenge, isn't it? You wouldn't want to be a hoarder, would you? In order
No,
to
you
have-
wouldn't want to be or want to be a weaver and have a loom or things like that.
Well, yeah, there's
Yeah.
some piano or,
Yeah, piano.
So you're talking to someone who's willing to really part ways with most of their possessions, really.
What we know about happiness and income is that it's a pretty flat curve. After you make a certain amount of money, you're no more happier.
What about knickknacks? I mean, they make you happy. But that's all right. No, look,
Yeah.
I think this is something that Councillor Stapleton has championed a lot, and I applaud her for that. I also support her moves to do that. I think that it does meet a lot of issues,
Yeah.
planning, homelessness and affordability, and who knows, we have to plan for tougher times. So what's your competition? So you're a business,
Yeah,
and do you know you've got a lot of competitors out there, and
yeah.
are you guys based in Casey?
We're in Castlemaine.
Castlemaine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're Victorian based, but we're
Yeah.
Um,
So there's not much of a question there. There's just a lot of comment, but
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I think there's a lot of people who are builders or handy and thinking, yeah, I'd like to get in there. I don't think there's a lot of money in it, but you have to be kind of a truly devoted person.
Yeah.
I guess I did want to, I feel that having, if I could just add and to reiterate that having gone to a lot of different places, and we've been in Canberra and Queensland and South Australia and Tassie, and people are, and we often get someone like Amanda, you know, a local councillor, come in to help present on in the workshop where to put a tiny house. And so I hear what a lot of different places are thinking about, and they are very divergent. In some places, it's looking quite hopeful. In Hobart, in Casey, in Mount Alexander Shire, where I am. But then there are other places that are looking at it differently and defining things in ways that are going to make it near impossible to have a tiny house on wheels. And I just want to say that the low-hanging fruit here of change is just what I presented. If you go down the road of seeing it as a building, it just doesn't fit the model. And when councils, you know, test it in the tribunals and the courts, they regularly lose. So I'm hoping to kind of give you the learning that we have about that and to think about them really as caravans and a special type of caravan.
Sure. The thing that comes to mind is something that was already mentioned about sewerage and those sorts of things. So
Yeah.
if it's a longer term living, and just how to address that
Yeah.
and to ensure that it doesn't go into someone's neighbour. You know, we're a bit over-regulated here perhaps, but
Yeah.
for the lack of, I think there's some benefits for being so. But yeah, finding
Yeah.
ways to meet
Yeah.
that, meet in the middle.
And I
Absolutely.
think that's where the creativity of staff and council really come to the fore. You know, it's one thing to just read the rules and say, this doesn't apply. It's another thing to bring your creativity, all your professional knowledge, and say, how can we make this happen? You know, how can we make sewage make sense in a tiny house? You
Yeah.
know?
That's good. Thanks.
Thank
Thank
you, Councillor Castani. Before I go for the amendment for Councillor Stapleton, just one thing, you mentioned about tiny houses for homeless people. So you'd be basically saying to the state government to purchase these tiny houses, or the people that look after homeless people, that they, rather than put them into homes, they purchase tiny houses for them?
Well, there've been a couple, the housing agencies have gotten on board. That, you know, caravan parks have housed the homeless for a while now in a lot of different places. And they've looked at it differently. In Mount Alexander Shire, they really like the idea of having a tiny house on wheels, because then it can go in and you can rest it in the backyard of the person's family and get them reconnected. And then that house then goes, after they're finished with it, and it serves somebody else. So they like the idea of the wheeled version. But in Gosford, New South Wales, they have done this already on foundations for the homeless. So one group, a nonprofit, built tiny houses on foundations got funding for it, and then another group is putting the people in there and rotating them through. So it's a collaborative. It was a nonprofit that did it, and they worked with City Council to create it in Gosford. And it's up and running, successful.
Thank you. Councillor Sabin, you want to make an amendment?
Yeah, I would, if I could just make a couple of comments, if it's okay. And going back to your question, at the moment we couldn't provide housing on a wheeled tiny house because speech impediment, because of our local law. And going back to Councillor Cristani's question about what we need to change at the state government level, the interesting thing that I found when I spoke to Fred is that we might not necessarily need to wait for that. We could change our own local law, and then we could do perhaps what Fremantle have done, and that is actually come to the table and say, what is it that could be a tiny house here in Casey? What would that look like? How do we meet the requirements, and where do we put them? The tiny houses, just to let you know, there's actually some tiny houses in Doveton, and they're providing a home for people with mental health issues. Now, they were essentially homeless, and it's a really great collaborative initiative between council and the state government, and it's absolutely fantastic. So we're not limiting to wheels or sizes. It's about the actual smaller dimension to a normal house. And it's also, it always was, in my mind, about looking at people like people at Tim's age, Susan's age. How do they buy into the market if they haven't got, they're just starting out? How do they, how do they stay in Casey? Because they often leave and go somewhere where houses are more affordable, going country, that sort of thing. So keeping them here in Casey, near their family, near their friends, with an affordable home, and that's always what's been on my mind. So I just thought I'd mention those couple of things, but certainly with the sewerage and the electricity and all of that, well, if you're going to look at sustainability, which is where we're heading here in Casey, there are a number of things you can do to live off-grid. And it's whether, again, getting around the table and really coming to an agreement about what that would look like and how we approve it. Instead of having people doing this illegally or, sort of without coming to us, we can probably embrace, the potential model for the future and make sure that we get people engaged and get them approved, and away they go. So that's just my comments in relation to that, and I hope Councillor Cristani could understand what I had to say then. So fabulous, thank you. If I could make a second point on our recommendation, if you don't mind, and that is that Council agree to meet with Fred and Ben, so it's Fred Schutz and Ben Harding, along with, with officers and interested councillors, to discuss further the possibility of tiny houses on wheels into the future. Okay with you?
Sorry, this always happens, that when we talk about tiny houses, we forget that there's the wheeled versions, and thank you.
That's why I said
awesome.
on wheels.
Yeah, well done. Yeah.
Yeah, so that, because I know that you,
Yeah.
because Fred's an advocate for tiny houses on wheels. There are many other models, as I just discussed, but we're going to be talking about tiny houses on wheels in this
great.
instance.
Oh, thank you.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Great.
I'll be back.
Yeah,
Good.
That recommendation is moved by Councillor Stapleton. Is a seconder for Councillor Rowe. Thank you. If that's, is there any dissent? No dissent? Then that's carried.
Thank you. Thank you, Ned. Thank
That's
you.
it. Thank you very much. General Purpose Committee meeting's over. Thank you very much for attending.